There are a ton of bad behavior moments in Family Guy, but some of the most heinous come from Stewie and Brian. From bloodlust and very criminal adventures, these two should honestly be locked up with the key thrown away, or possibly even thrown into the psych ward in some cases. We're looking at you, Stewie. From framing to crime sprees and even cruel actions to each other, these two can actually be pretty hard to like from time to time. Let's be real here, Stewie on his own has done plenty that should have resulted in him behind bars. But Stewie and Brian together is a whole other batch of trouble with a capital T. Take this instance for example. Brian drives over to Stewie's daycare, which is already a red flag, and Carrie Underwood's Before He Cheats comes on the radio. Of all songs in the universe, that's basically Stewie's jam, and he insists on staying in the car to hear the rest of the tune. Only Stewie screws up royally, and one thing leads to another. After accidentally hitting the gear stick, he decides he may as well take the car for a spin. He naturally wrecks it and runs away when Brian tells him he has to own up to totaling the car.
Do you know anything about this?
About what? About what a beautiful day?
Brian may be the family dog, and they say a dog is man's best friend, but Brian may be one of the worst characters on Family Guy, along with the infant Stewie. One of Brian's most heinous cases may not result in him being locked up, but it is one of the cruelest things one can do. Brian had cut himself off from his estranged son, Dylan, for many years, not wanting anything to do with his boy. But when Brian learns that Dylan is going to be playing a role in an upcoming Disney show, Brian actually reaches out to him, but not for any sort of loving reason. Oh no. Brian simply wanted a job as a writer to further his career. Brian, in the process of crushing Dylan once he makes the connection, also derails the entire show with his shenanigans. No one likes feeling rejected or ignored, but we usually find a way to communicate those feelings with words. Brian, however, resorted to animalistic mayhem and carnage to make his point about Stewie's teddy bear, Rupert.
Stop! Look, why are you being such a jerk over a stupid bear?
Brian was feeling increasingly left out and ignored when Stewie began paying a lot of attention to Rupert. So after a few too many, he intentionally rips the stuffed animal to pieces out of jealousy for not getting enough attention. The action infuriates Stewie, who despite being an evil genius, is still a baby. Brian at least learns a lesson and gives Stewie a new Rupert. But still, Brian's knee-jerk reaction was to eliminate the competition. What would happen if that was a real person? Would Brian have done the same thing? Our guess is probably yes. That's the question Stewie posed, and this mad genius decided to find the answer after his plan to eliminate a bully failed. Stewie believes the reason his plan didn't succeed was because he's lost some of the evil in him. So he makes a clone of himself, hoping that twice the trouble will make up for it.
That's why I didn't feel more evil. All the evil energy went into him.
Only the clone is straight up evil, and is only content with causing harm to everybody. This Stewie cuts off poor Brian's tail, feeds it to the real Stewie, then terminates a woman and steals her car. That loss of life is totally on you, Stewie. Thankfully, Brian puts an end to evil Stewie, but still, blood on his hands. Lock him up. Is it just us, or does a dog who sleeps around with human women seem weird in 2019? Was it always weird? What makes Brian even worse in this regard, however, is that he seems to like to go after married women. Case in point, when he met Tori. Tori is married to a Navy SEAL named Wick, but that doesn't stop her from getting it on with Brian on more than one occasion.
Wow, he really has no idea. Hey, want to take a shower with me?
Sure.
Brian poses as a normal dog in order to continue his scandalous affair right under Vic's nose. Thankfully for Brian, his affair with Vic's wife Tori is never discovered, and Stewie ultimately rescues him from the house as Vic started using Brian as a guard dog to keep an eye out for the devious cheater. Nothing says terrible, sin-worthy, or downright twisted like eliminating your own mother, and that's exactly what Stewie did, sort of. This particular incident comes from the two-parter episode Stewie Kills Lois and Lois Kills Stewie. In this segment, Stewie finally makes good on his word and actually gets the chance to eliminate Lois. Brian wins 2 cruise tickets and gives them to Lois, who naturally brings Peter. Stewie says enough is enough and takes his speedboat to the ship and straight up terminates his mom. This leads to a chain of events that include Stewie becoming the president, but in the end, the whole ordeal was actually just a simulation, proving to Stewie that he just wasn't ready yet. But there's more violent mayhem during the whole simulated offing of one's mother. After the deed was done and Lois ultimately returned, Stewie makes a run for it and ends up taking his own family hostage. Armed with a gun, he tells Lois to give him some food. Being a villain is hungry work after all, and that's when Cleveland came in. Without even hesitating, Stewie put one right in Cleveland's heart. Stewie then proceeds to hide the body under the couch cushions and kidnaps Brian. You know, because when it rains, it pours. In the span of this arc, Stewie himself has offed 2 primary characters and has resorted to kidnapping his best friend. Could he get any lower? We think the answer is most certainly yes. This instance would have most certainly resulted in Brian being put behind bars if not for the fact that he pulled this stunt on someone he knew and not a complete stranger. Brian is in need of teeth replacement surgery and Quagmire, despite hating Brian's guts, offers to pay for the procedure. Brian ends up with some rather large teeth that are perfect for selling real estate. Instead of thanking Quagmire for his help getting him where he is, he pulls a fast one on him and tricks Quagmire into buying rundown property, then ghosting him after the deal was made. Talk about some shady business practices, piled on top of tricking your friend right after he helped you. Brian got off easy, if you ask us. Despite being hot for crime and mayhem, Stewie does have the most unusual of soft spots: trendy radio pop music. In this particular episode, Stewie simply had to attend the Hannah Montana show. Unfortunately for him, the show sells out before he can claim any tickets, which basically breaks him, but it doesn't stop him. So what does he do? He tracks down Brian's family and straight up kidnaps them. But it doesn't stop there. Things get pretty graphic as Stewie begins to do all kinds of terrible things to them, including putting them in an Iron Maiden, stretching them out Braveheart style, and one dog even exploded. All of this was done just to get Brian to help him procure some tickets. Remember how we were talking about how Brian likes to get it on with human women? Well, it didn't stop at Tori, and now we're putting the spotlight on Kate. Love is blind, as they say, but Kate is actually blind, which is perfect for Brian. One of the few things Kate openly hates are dogs. But because she's blind, she doesn't know that the person talking right at her is also a dog. So Brian manipulates every scenario to come across as a human in order to win Kate's affection. In other words, he's straight up manipulating and taking advantage of her. Brian nearly got away with it too, until he met the parents who could clearly see him. Let's stay with Brian for a bit, because he really steps out of line when it comes to this particular incident. We know Brian is something of a womanizer, but Brian has always had the hots for Lois Griffin, something that stays on the down low. But in one episode, Peter and Lois are having some issues, and Lois seems comfortable with Brian. The two share some wine, and it all seems pretty romantic and even kind. Of course, this is Family Guy, and that doesn't last. Brian pounces on Lois and tries to force himself on her. Yep, Brian tried to force himself on Peter's wife and didn't quite seem to understand what no meant. Thankfully, Lois was able to put a stop to it because, you know, he's still a dog.
Brian, I think you'd better go.
It's one thing for Stewie to do physical harm to a bunch of unwilling participants, but it's quite another to refuse to help someone. After Lois smacks him, Stewie runs up to his room and begins taking a trip down memory lane, one riddled with guilt. He states he's not been this scared since he left Mother Teresa herself to OD in his car. In the scene in question, we see Mother Teresa unconscious in the car with vomit all over her robes. Stewie at least drives to the hospital and instructs his passengers to help push her stone-cold body out of the car for the hospital staff to deal with. Talk about a dark ending for one of the kindest beings in history. You wouldn't think it, considering all the crap that goes on between the two characters, but Stewie and Brian are actually pretty close. So much so that Stewie wants to cement his friendship with Brian with a blood pact. Brian obliges, but if he had any semblance of a moral compass, he would have refused to do this. That's because Brian has herpes and was fully aware of it. When he did the pact with Stewie, he passed it to him, who woke up with a very uncomfortable looking mark on his mouth. But it didn't stop at Stewie. Despite this, he also passed his herpes on to Chris. Brian showed no remorse and passed a dangerous infection towards his family. There's not many ways to get a punchline out of this one. Mind control may sound like a cool thing when you're a kid, but Stewie doesn't think like a kid. So when he comes in possession of such a device, you can expect dark and twisted results. When Stewie learns that he's too young to go to college, he uses the mind control device to take control of Chris's body. But now Stewie has a minion under his complete control. So what do you think he wants to do? If your answer involved Lois, then you're dead right. Of course he fails, but Stewie willingly wanted to terminate his own mother and make his brother do it so that Stewie could do the deed without ever getting his hands dirty. That's really twisted, Stewie. There's nothing like a little crossover magic to boost viewership, and that's exactly what Family Guy did in 2014 when it shared the limelight with The Simpsons. So of course many people were happy to see what would happen when Bart and Stewie crossed paths. The two were an instant match, getting into all kinds of trouble, that is until Nelson started starts bullying Bart. Not one to let bullies get away with anything, Stewie then kidnaps Nelson and forces him to eat his shorts. He doesn't stop there either. Stewie also captures Sideshow Bob, Skinner, Jimbo, and even a poo, simply so that he could say, "I took a poo." We think Stewie was having a little too much fun capturing people that he didn't even know. No one likes a bully, and many of us likely were tormented by one at some point in our lives. Many of us wished we could do something about it, and Stewie was one of those who actually got his revenge. But should he have? After the bully beats up Stewie and steals his tricycle, he tracks the guy down and ties him in the house and threatens to use a laser gun on him. Lois finds the tricycle, however, and comes in to tell Stewie. When she asks what's going on, Stewie says they're simply playing house, then specifies Roman Polanski's house, referring to the Manson family incident at Polanski's home. Why stop at kidnapping, eh, Stewie? Despite his nefarious ways, Stewie is still a baby and needs to do baby things like go to daycare. But Stewie's daycare is unsafe for toddlers, and yet, despite knowing this, Brian willingly lets Stewie's suffering continue. Brian plans of letting the supervisor know what he thinks of the dump, but once he sees that Emily is attractive and wearing a bikini, plans change. From there, Brian completely forgets about Stewie's plight at the daycare and tries to score a hot date with Emily. Meanwhile, Stewie continues to suffer at the daycare, which is run down and not fit to house children. Emily even dislocates Stewie's shoulder, and Brian forbids him from telling anyone what happened. Upon learning Emily has a boyfriend, he then calls the cops on her, knowing he can't do anything with her. When it comes to moments like this, we can't help but think Stewie would be a great enforcer for the mob, rather than a criminal mastermind. This incident happens while Peter is away in England and Stewie becomes a bookie. Brian, in turn, places a bet for a fight between Mike Tyson and Carol Channing. Let's just say that Brian made a bad bet, but doesn't exactly want to pay up to a baby. Stewie doesn't like this though and actually goes to town on his friend. He breaks his legs, sets him on fire, and shatters glass in his eyes, just to get the payment. Suddenly, a job becomes more important to Stewie than his friend. Is it funny? Is it too much? Let us know. Things get a little crazy for Brian and Stewie when they board a yacht to engage in a rescue mission. Stewie, always prepared for such an occasion, produces 2 firearms from his person, along with 2 silencers, and gives one to a reluctant Brian. Of course, once he gets a taste for bloodshed, Brian changes. He begins to see the act of shooting armed goons as a video game level and begins to really enjoy his rampage, taking out guards left and right. Proud of his abilities to suddenly become John Wick, Brian then decides to shoot a random waiter on another boat just for the fun of it. He tries to make it look cool too by taking the shot without looking at his target. What is even going on, Brian? After Peter watches the hit show Jackass, he decides to try and perform his own stunts. Naturally, this fails horribly and Peter begins to drown, and Brian throws out his back trying to save him. This prompts Peter to buy a new dog, one that may save him in the future if the need comes again. The new dog is playful and friendly, which is a big hit with the family. Well, everyone except Stewie, that is. The line is crossed when he learns his teddy bear was violated by this new dog. This causes Stewie to gruesomely dispose of new Brian, with bits and pieces being thrown into the trash if you catch our drift. Stewie is a proper little psycho, isn't he? Back in the early days of the show, Stewie was still a little bit on the psychotic side, but he was also a little bit too literal about certain things. He believed that his imminent future was going to involve his return to Lois's womb, and Stewie could not allow himself to return to said prison, as he puts it. He flees to an airport to make a run for it, but the guard questions an infant going to the airport alone and gives him some life advice. For his act of kindness, Stewie freezes him in carbonite, much like Vader did to Han in Empire Strikes Back. Moral of the story? Don't be nice to Stewie. What's one thing you need when you have a baby? A babysitter. And the Griffins hire one to take care of Stewie. Much to his amazement, Stewie ends up having a crush on LaDawn. But there's no happy ending here, as LaDawn already has a boyfriend named Jeremy. This makes Stewie extremely jealous as he wanted her all to himself. So he sneaks into Jeremy's place, beats him to a pulp, and locks him in the trunk of Peter's car. But Stewie wasn't getting anywhere with LaDawn after that. He must have really focused on that task, as he actually forgot about Jeremy and only remembers about him some weeks later, implying that he's likely croaked after no food or water for that duration. In the episode PD4, Brian ends up getting a job at the suicide hotline after he finds himself short on cash. Surprise, surprise to everyone, he ends up falling for one of his female coworkers at the same time. Of course, Brian fails miserably at getting Martha's attention and begins to stalk her online, doing some pretty gross things in the process. If you've seen the episode, you know what we're talking about here. But Martha catches Brian during his alone time with her Facebook pictures. Brian, still desperate for money, frames Martha by planting narcotics at her desk and calling the cops on her. When words fail, getting your coworkers a lengthy prison sentence seems to be the answer. according to Brian at least. With all the crazy and immoral things Stewie has done by now considering his age, it's no wonder that he hasn't seen a psychologist sooner in his life. But by the time the 16th season rolled around, that's exactly what the infant did for one episode. Stewie actually gets pretty candid with his shrink, even talking about his persona and his British accent, an accent the British doctor can't seem to hear himself. The doc then begins to have a heart attack, and Stewie actually lets the doctor croak because he doesn't want his confessions and secrets to be known by any living person. So in the name of ego, he condemns a man doing his job. We have to wonder what Freud would say about that one. We've talked about how Brian will do anything to win the favor of an attractive lady, and that he also has done some questionable immoral actions. But this final entry combines both of them together into one terrible act. Brian sees a car with an attractive female driver on the verge of rolling into the water. Seeing this as the perfect moment to be a hero, save the lady, and score with her afterwards, he rushes to save her. But Brian quickly learns that this lady has a baby in the back seat, and he accidentally lets go of the rear bumper, condemning the mother and baby to drowning in the water. That's just cold, Brian. Really cold. Brian was only trying to save the woman from drowning, expecting some kind of reward, but knowing that that was off the table, he would rather let two people perish. That's all of our compelling evidence as to why Stewie and Brian should have been locked up, possibly with the key thrown away. What's your favorite criminal moment the duo have done, and which act do you think should have been an instant lockup? Let us know what you think in the comments below, and be sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more videos like this in your playlist each and every day. Thanks for watching!